often start with a kind of this day in history kind of thing. And we didn't really plan on that, but then something, thankfully, I remembered not long ago. But on the day we're recording this on July 22nd. And on July 22nd, 1946, 79 years ago, um, a group of Israeli terrorists, the Irgun, blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And I think it's particularly appropriate to mention that today because what we're seeing in Gaza and the West Bank and really all over the region is a continuation of what Israel has been doing now for, almost 8 decades in this particular context. Um, After World War One, the Europeans divided up the old Ottoman Empire and gave these European nations, like the British and the French, mandates over them. Mandates are basically control. They were mandatory systems. And the mandate for Palestine, and remember, it's Palestine, there ain't no Israel, went to the British. However, during World War II, and especially because of the Holocaust, there's the significant impetus now for the Zionist project, which I'm sure we all know about, right? And so after World War II, you started to see an influx of European Jews, especially into Palestine. And they wanted the British out. The only thing, and the Arabs, the British are an occupying force, and the Arabs didn't get along with them either, right? But the Israelis wanted the British out. Now, the Jewish settlers created a military wing called the Haganah. Uh, Offshoots of that were what we would definitely refer to, and were called at the time terrorist groups, one of which was the Irgun, which was led by Menachem Begin, who would later become prime minister of Israel, which would be like making Charlie Manson the president. So the Haganah and even more the Irgun wanted the British out. In 1946, the Haganah was working closely with these international groups of Jewish settlers who were coming in, and the British found out about that. They did an undercover operation, and they got hold of documents linking Haganah to these terrorist activities. And because of that, Irgun wanted to get that back or to destroy those documents. So on the morning of July 22nd, 1946, they put bombs in a pickup truck that they had hijacked, and they delivered them to the kitchen, which was on the basement of the King David Hotel. King David Hotel was a functioning hotel. It had guests. It had, convention rooms and hotel rooms and whatnot. And in one of the corners, the British Mandate Authority was headquartered. And so the Irgun brought these bombs in, and Menachem Begin said that the goal was to turn Palestine into a glass house with the entire world looking in. This was planned as a terrorist activity to terrorize the British and to force them out. So that was the purpose. It wasn't, they didn't cover it up like they're doing today. It's Hamas or it's humanitarianism or whatever, right? So these Irgun operatives go in, they disguise themselves as Arabs, they wore kafayas, they planted the bombs, and it exploded. It blew up. This is probably the first major act of terrorism directed at a media audience, directed at a public audience, right? It wasn't just to attack a certain individual or group of people who would then be frightened off. It was directed to the entire world, and it succeeded on that level. 91 people were killed. The majority of them had no connection to either the British mandate or any kind of political operatives, right? I think of the 91 dead, I believe about 30 or so were British and about 20 were Jewish, which is, similar to October 7th when, after the initial misinformation that the New York Times and others fed us, we found out that about 400 of those Jewish concert goers that day on October 7th, 2023, were actually killed by the IDF, right? So the King David Hotel bombing is really critical. It's an act of terrorism, open act, a dedicated act of terrorism. And that was the purpose all along. That was the intent all along. And it worked. It worked. The British didn't have that much interest in the area to stay there and risk more bombings and more terrorism and spending more money there. So they got out, and then, 2 years later, you have the creation of the state of Israel. Looking way ahead now, kind of fast forwarding significantly, what we've seen in the last, 20 months is this media narrative about terrorism, which generally focuses on Hamas. And October 7th is seen as like day one, right? You know how they call the atomic bombing day one. Well, that's kind of how this particular crisis now is being kind of, sold, right? This is day one. This is when it all began. Well, this, anybody who studied this knows that's preposterous. But with regard to kind of the idea that terrorism is a fully operational idea, and what Israel does, what Israel has always done, what it did before it was even Israel, is really critical there. And so, again, not that we really need the information, and not that anybody who is a hardcore Zionist is going to accept any kind of countervailing evidence anyway. But, it's very clear that we now have, mountains of evidence that these terrorist activities, have been going on for about 8 decades. The King David Hotel bombing preceded the Nakba by a little bit, right? And, it led into, what we now see is this, really in most ways uninterrupted attack on Palestinians all over Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank. And, it also spreads out into Lebanon and Iran and Syria. So Israel as a terrorist force, in this particular case, the Irgun, led by future Prime Minister Menachem Begin, bombed the King David Hotel, killed a significant group of British mandatory officials, British government officials, and it used that as a springboard to get statehood and to begin the eradication of Palestinian culture, Palestinian society, and Palestinian life. And so it's an important event, and we, it's worth thinking about today on this 79th anniversary.
Yep. I'm going to segue to the next thing.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks for sharing that, Bob. I think that's an important this day in history, which we actually haven't done in a while, but I think it's an important one to mention today, particularly with